Thanks, Roger. That was really humbling, and I'm not sure I can live up to that, so I will try to do the best that I can. They told me to put my 60-minute talk into 20 minutes, so I'd like you to fasten your seatbelts, and we're going to try to go through this as quickly as we can and look at some issues with seasonal infertility. I just want to do just a tiny bit of a review and take a look at what is seasonal hog price patterns in the United States. And what we find is look where our profit picture is. So if we look at above 100, that means we're making a profit. When we're below 100, we're not making as much money on these pigs. And in the United States, one of the surveys that got done, they figured that 75% of the profitability of pork production is made during the time period when you have to breed to have the pigs that are born from seasonal infertility. So it really affects us on a marketing situation as to what we do. And so we know that this whole scheme, I'm not going through this because I don't want to waste the time on this type of thing, but what it tells us is when we change day length, the sow actually gets impacted by this. It affects the pineal gland, we get a release of melatonin, and we get a whole cascade of hormonal responses that can occur after this. Ali Peltonimi gave a presentation for me at one of the big animal science symposiums that we did, and I really liked this slide from the standpoint because it made the most sense to me. I could never figure out why I could have two fantastic farms side by side, 2 miles apart, built exactly the same, everything the same. One farm didn't have seasonal infertility and the other one got creamed. And it's like, okay, what happened? What changed here? So when we take a look at this, photoperiod does cause seasonal infertility. We know that's true. We also know these other effectors can actually alter or how much seasonal infertility do we actually see. What you'll find out is I'm going to focus most of my talk on this one, feeding and heat stress. Those two effectors probably give us the most problem with what actually happens with seasonal infertility. When we can correct both of these, we find this almost has zero effect. And I'm going to give you an example of a farm that I've got out in Nebraska that actually sees virtually no influence at all to seasonal infertility now. Okay, we know that proportion of gilt cycling by month changes. No matter what we do with gilts, when we get to this time period of the year, we do not get the same breeding percentages and the number of animals that actually exhibit estrus near as well. There's things we can do to try to help counteract that, but the biggest one I can tell you first is you got to plan to have more gilts for seasonal infertility. You can't keep the same production flow you were running. It doesn't work. You've got to have more gilts coming into the system for this time period, and we can counteract this in a hurry. We also know when we do in vitro work and we collect ovaries from a packing plant and we take a look during this time period of the year, and what we find is the oocyte quality is always much worse. No matter what manipulations we're doing, whether it's just in vitro fertilization, and that's what this example is, it goes to about the 4-cell stage and they die off. What actually ties to that and connects to that? It's how much feed they eat. Feed consumption during lactation is a humongous driver of what happens with this oocyte quality of your pig. In that time period of the year, what happens? We get a lot of gilts or we get first parity, and what happens? They eat less. And then all of a sudden, we start getting second parity dip on far as pig numbers. We get weaned estrus intervals that lengthen out on us. And so those are things that we are concerned with. How do we help counteract some of this? If we take a look at the issue of select your biggest pigs at birth, select your biggest pigs at weaning, females, you will tend to find that you will help improve the issue of their response and lifetime productivity. They will get through seasonal infertility better than the smaller, younger pigs, and particularly those below 1.17 kilograms. All right. So, what's another issue that we've got? Doing your pubertal estrus stimulation is much, much harder in the summer. Summer months, doesn't matter how well we do it. There's a lot of factors that go into this. I go into these barns with big tunnel ventilation, and they walk one boar down the alleyway, and hoping that these gilts are going to come into estrus. They likely can't even smell him, because guess what? They got enough airflow blowing through there, their ears are flapping in the breeze, and they're going, oh yeah, well, he's not interesting. Okay? They're looking for the right smell. We've got to do things differently, particularly for the summer months, to really change the impact. This is a system that George Foxcroft and Jenny Patterson developed and put together and did a bunch of research on. But what they do is they put a battery of boars and they move the gilts to the boar pens. Now we're going to show you why that's so significant and why it's important. If we look at pubertal estrus, it's different than if you're looking for their second estrus. Pubertal estrus is a very difficult one to stimulate. I've got groups like in parts of Asia where they wait till the boar is done in the stud. They're 3 and 4 years old, and they turn them out, and that's who they use for their heat checkers for the gilts. If you ever put an animal that big in a gilt pen, what do? And it's like, oh my gosh. And they all zip to the corners, they're climbing the walls, they don't want a thing to do with him. Second thing is, he's probably already sort of past his prime. He doesn't have much pheromone or testosterone anymore. We've got a problem. Okay, take a look at this and how we stimulate puberty. Gilts left in a pen. If we do nothing, we have no gilts that make it by 220 pounds that they find their puberty. Now, why am I interested in this pubertal estrus so much? If we can stimulate gilts to find this estrus as early as we can, we will figure out who are going to be our highest productive females for the rest of their lifetime. A lot of these females that come in early will actually go to 6 parities. They'll do a great job of raising pigs. And so that's why it's so critical to us. Gilts mixed with other gilts. Look at this. We get a move of 26%. All I have to do is put different females in there. Somebody the other day in a meeting I was speaking in said, what if I put an old sow that's, in heat, whatever. As long as she's not too heavy or breaking the gilts down on their leg structure and that, yeah, they're great ones because they'll make sure they find or help stimulate the issue of jumping on those gilts if they're in estrus. Here's the one I can't get people to grab onto enough. Fence line with the boar is barely better than mixing with gilts. We got a problem. I see so many scenarios where that's what they do. They walk a boar by and that's heat checking. It's not. Not for pubertal estrus. You can do that once they've had their first estrus. Now you can expose them to that boar and maybe get much better response to the boar, but not a pubertal estrus. What we see is boars brought to the gilts. Put the boar in the pen, and a lot of times they use the same boar day after day after day. Don't do that. Because if he's not interesting the first time, he might not be interesting the next few times also. Make sure he's at least 10 months of age. Do not use them younger than that. If you do for pubertal estrus, you're going to fail. All right? If you use Meishan genetics in with that, you can go down to a younger age. But if you use particularly the English breeds and of swine, I would suggest to make sure to at least be 10 months of age. Our maternal lines tend to be later than most of our paternal line animals. And so a lot of times my preference is make some matings where that your heat check boars are coming from the paternal line, not the maternal lines. Gilts taken to the boars. Look at this difference. How does it do it in nature? It doesn't in nature by the females The matriarchs are out in the pasture and that. The boar stays off by himself, eats acorns by the trees and whatever. He'd like to go up the hill, but they're going, no, 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 you stay away from us. They go to him. Same thing happens here. Look at the differential for pubertal estrus. That's a very big key if you want to help try to improve your receptivity of those females, and if they come into estrus, do this. Add this to your program. All right. 5 priorities for optimum gilt pool management. Again, this is weight levels that are used in the United States, more in the European levels. I'm not sure, in some of the genetics here in Australia, they will tend to be a little under this weight range, and so I'm not telling you the exact weight range. This is what we have to use in the United States. Gilts after 135 kgs up to about 160 kgs. After that, you start losing more money in non-productive days. You also lose on the animal's productivity. Begin heat detection early, 140 days to 170 days. What I find, this works great for us researchers. It doesn't fit very many farm systems. Most farm systems have to start somewhere in this range, about 160 days to 170 days, and they get a better result. And so again, but we're still trying to find who comes into estrus early for us. Here's one I put a lot more pressure on. Implement proper heat detection, 90% of the gilt cycle after 4 to 6 weeks. Provide adequate time to isolate, acclimate, and cool off incoming gilts. Do not create a scenario where you increase inflammation by creating a disease problem, bringing gilts in too early. Plan 20 months ahead for what you got to target for your gilt numbers. Know your gilt needs. Try to be 20 weeks ahead at least. Okay. Pubertal estrus. Bore power got to be at least 11 plus months, if particularly a maternal line. Paternal line, I can go down to about 10 months usually. Low ammonia in the building. I go to these buildings and you sit there and they've got over 50 parts per million of ammonia coming off their flooring, and you sit there and I can't even breathe in that. No wonder the gilts can't smell the boars very well. So make sure that you're doing things to keep your air quality and that we don't have a problem with ammonia. Plenty of gilts on hand. Take gilts to the boar. Heat check every day, at least 10 minutes. Do not skip a day when you're doing for pubertal estrus. If you do, even one day will actually lengthen out your time frame for them to come into heat. And so you want to be very careful of that. All right, here's the other big one. Is this issue that we've got to make sure we try to help protect against how much do they eat, particularly our first parity females, and they already consume, if we look at this glass is the amount of feed that they eat. They consume about 15% less than what our sows do on the average. So what we see is we've got this cascade, and that you fulfill maintenance and priorities this way. And the last one in this cascade, they don't meet reproduction. It's not an all or none response. It is an issue where it's a graded response, but it's decreasing the amount of hormone that that animal is going to probably produce from their ovaries with each of these drops and what happens to productivity. The body's trying to protect itself against, ooh, are you ready for reproduction or not? Maybe we need to skip a heat after we get weaned. That's a possibility with what happens here. All right. Not trying to make you experts at the hormone or the cascade. I'd like you to just understand why it's so critical that we get as much nutrients as we can into these females. Is their amount of protein or amino acids, actually, essentially, and their amount of carbohydrates that they consume is a signal to the brain to tell it what to do with their hormone patterns. It's done through low insulin levels. Low insulin for amino acids causes the hypothalamus to decrease GnRH. And so we get the cascade that it's shutting down the system a bit. It's just decreasing it. If we don't have enough carbohydrates, it does the same, but it affects a different portion of the brain. It affects the pituitary gland. And it's telling it, don't do LH and FSH, or lower it. And so we get a lower amount of hormones being produced by the ovaries. What does that do to us? It lengthens out wean to estrus interval. It will also give you will start getting a cascade where you're aging the oocytes differently. So as you lower the hormone, what happens is they don't all age at the same. And what it does, everybody thought, well, we used to think that it was because they were too immature. They're too mature. So low hormone matures them too rapidly. That's why they die at the 4-cell stage, and you don't see that everybody thinks it's an ovulation difference. It's not. It's a difference in quality of those eggs and the survival of that. All right. I'm going to skip those for time's sake. This one's important. If we take a look at ovaries, if you go to packing plant and we've got gilts, and I get so many times I get called into things and go, my gilts aren't working, they're just not breeding or anything. If we go there and they have all three of these structures, the follicles, the CLs, and the corpus albicans, the CLs that are decreasing, and they become a little scar tissue on the ovary. If it has all three of these, that's a normal ovary. It means they're cycling, they're doing what they're supposed to do. Most often we find most of these gilts actually look like this. We get some that look like these, but here's a warning that I'll tell anybody. If you waited to 300 days and you're still trying to get them bred, these are animals that should not be there in the farm. And I have a lot of locations, they'll hold them clear out to 300 days still trying to get them bred. You're not going to be successful. By 230 days, if they're not bred and they haven't given you a pubertal estrus, they got to be gone. Move them out of there and you'll be much, much better off. Okay, one last one, heat stress. I don't want to go through all this, what happens with it. The big result of all of what happens with heat stress is the blood flow goes to the extremities, trying to cool off. The pig doesn't do like I'm doing, sweating right now. How are you guys in your seatbelts? Everybody okay? Am I going fast enough or slow enough? All right. If we look at this, what we see is we get reduced feed intake when we get really hot. How many have ever, out baling hay? I remember we used to always do the little hand bales and you do them all day long and it's hot. My mom always had this big banquet food when you're there. It's the last thing you want. You're just not hungry. All you want to do is drink something and take a break for a while. That happens to the animals. The other thing we find, the whole big issue that we're looking for is what happens to the intestinal tract. Do we get into problems with gut leakage? That's the big driver of what is bad about heat stress. What you'll find is the first heat stress that they have occur, it will usually be the most dramatic for them. They heal up quite rapidly from it, but what we find is it is a very big impact on our industry in the United States. If you count the sows and the grow-finish animals, it is about $1 billion loss to the swine industry in the U.S. All right? Here's that issue that we're doing. We're breaking those tight junctions, and this thing is breaking down. And if this opens up, what it does is it allows stuff from the intestinal tract to get into the body. Okay, that's just a simple version of this. This thing breaks down due to oxidative stress. O2, gets in there and then breaks down these protein strands, and then we have a problem. Here's what it looks like. If we look at our thermal neutral control animals, they were at 18 degrees C. We look at our other pair-fed thermal neutral. These animals had to eat the same quantity of feed the two heat stress groups ate. What we see is that their villi are actually shortened and thickened, and this is a very common response. What we find is the immunological response to these is almost as severe as the heat stress. So out-of-feed events are something really to worry about as far as what does it do to this intestinal tract. Now, if I can focus a little more, the two that I'd rather show you is this issue of looking at heat stress control versus our heat stress with a zinc amino acid complex put in there as a partial substitution in it. And what we see is these villi are in much more better shape than all the ends on our controls were completely broken off. So heat stress can cause us quite an issue. If we look at an immunological effect of this, it's this. Here's the heat stress controls. We're looking at plasma lipopolysaccharide binding proteins. It's the immune component that picks up what we call endotoxins. And it will attach to that, take those to the macrophage, and gets them out of the body. If we get too much of this in there, we get a very sick animal. We get release particularly of TNF-alpha, tumor necrosis factor alpha, interleukin-1, and we've measured all of these other components within this system. What we see here, the source of zinc made a difference in what actually happens to the amount of endotoxin and the amount of the protective factor that is in the enterocytes. We have a new project on that is just being completed. The paper is not done yet, and I can't release any of the new information, but we are very excited about the further looking at the recovery phase, growth phase after that, and we're finding, again, a very big difference in what's happening. Nutrient partitioning and inflammation. If we take a look at this, now we add an inflammatory issue to it, and guess what? Whoops, I'm sorry. And what we get is now we got real problems meeting the needs energy-wise, particularly if I'm first parity, and this issue that as we add any kind of stressor, you're adding an increased problem of how nutrients are going to get utilized. So if we look at things that are actually helping heat stress, betaine, Australia probably has more work on this than any other country as far as the effects of betaine on heat stress. We can tick that box. Avela zinc, we're quite encouraged with the responses with this. Chromium is also showing particular responses in heat stress, particularly in birds. Synthetic amino acids is a very good option because what it does is you lower your amount of need for space with your whole proteins, and you can use the synthetic amino acids to decrease your heat stress effect. Fatty acids and fats, there's some new data out on this. We're still sort of on hold as to where we actually think this issue might be going, etc. We do know that fatty acid ratios have a big impact on inflammatory, non-inflammatory fat sources. We do know that our white grease that we use in the United States is actually decreasing reproductive performance. We don't know that we can actually do the fatty acid ratio and change the actual phenomenon of seasonal infertility. So that's where we're at this point in time. Okay, if we take a look at management things, feed intake and lactation, body condition and gestation. One of the top herds I work with is right now producing 5 different systems, 5,000 sows, that they are all group housing. And what is intriguing with those is that they virtually see 0 seasonal infertility. Their farrowing rate does not decrease. They have a 95% farrowing rate for all 5 systems. They wean 35 pigs per sow per year, and they don't see that number move. You can look at the months and weeks. I got to see it before I came, so I can be confident in saying what I am, that they have a big difference. I say, okay, what are you doing differently? Well, they have air conditioning, they have cool cells on their farrowing rooms, they pull air through that. They don't try to use too much airflow because then we've got chilling on the pigs. What we do is really focus on keeping the sow cool. So with their cooling system, they also add drip cooling, and as soon as they hit 80 degrees, the drippers go on the sows and is automatically in the system. They keep their lactation consumption much, much higher than a lot of the herds I work with in the United States. decreased body weight loss and lactation, weaned to estrus intervals. They also do one other thing that's really intriguing. They do not breed any animal. They actually cull every animal that is over 7 days. That's an immediate cull. Any animal that repeats is an immediate cull. And any animal over 6 parity is an immediate cull. And it really changes their productivity. I think there's hints that tell us we can do some things differently. Now, we got to be a bit careful. They can't afford to lose very many first parity females. They've got to at least get them through 4 parities because they're really driving costs because you're putting a lot of females into the game. But they do a really interesting job with what they get. Light, temperature, ventilation, insulation in buildings. There's tons and tons of work on this. Unfortunately, if you add up all the issues on trying to measure light and all the research papers, it looks like it's about a wash, and we don't really know if there's really an effect or not an effect. I find most buildings just cannot close out enough light to keep the pattern that they want to. There are all kinds of groups that'll say you got to have 16 hours of light, you got to be able to read a newspaper easily in the light during that time frame, and then you shut the lights off. You got to give them a rest time. I had one group, they left the lights on all the time. Their sows all came in bags under their eyes. They're all, they're all tired, okay? Anyway, so don't get sows too fat. All right, technology and science, it's what we do with it that really becomes important. This is a little video I'd like to show you, and it's in German. I think it is. I can have people verify it in the room for me. And she's asking her dad, how did you like your birthday present? You can watch it from there. Thank you very much.
Sag mal, Papa, habe ich dich noch gar nicht gefragt. Wie kommst du eigentlich mit dem neuen iPad zurecht, was wir dir zum Geburtstag geschenkt haben?
Oh, I liked it fine.
Mit den ganzen Apps kommst du klar?
Was denn für Apps? Geh mal bitte nicht Stift zur Seite.
I think you all got the message, right? If we don't use technology properly, we don't investigate where we're going with this data and that, we really can get ourselves into trouble. And so anyway, he's in trouble, I think. Biggest move against the seasonal infertility, feed intake and lactation. I'm convinced it is your #1 issue you got to do. Breed only sows with weaned estrus intervals less than 7 days. I'm not recommending that. I'm just telling you what is being done in a few of these units that are having really good success. And so I don't know if it's the right thing to do. If it's this, then at first parity females that go beyond this, I'd hold them, breed them on their second heat. And we find that gives us a big boost back on productivity. Excellent heat checking, particularly gilts, right number of gilts. Qualify your bores for fertility testing. And what we found in this, and I've got 3 different systems that have done it now, they qualify every single bore. They do 30 to 50 matings. And what they're really looking for are just the bores that are in trouble. We can't read other than motility, basically, and which ones really impact fertility. Not looking at the issue of what the sow dynamics is with this. It's just do we have a poor quality bore in that group. What you'll find in pooling semen, if you're putting a poor quality bore in there, all of the others move to the level of that bore, basically. They don't go to the level of the highest bore in the group. So that's why we put a lot more pressure on this, and this one is really helping us. Thank you very much for your attention. I think I'm a couple of minutes over my time frame. Undo your seat belts. Thank you very, very, very much.
Thanks very much, Mark. And we obviously have different time frames in the US and Australia, but you're a little bit over. But I mean, it was interesting enough to allow to keep going. So we have time for about 2 questions, but more important, Mark and all the speakers are going to be available at morning tea, and you're here for the next few days, aren't you, Mark?
I am.
So any questions to Mark? Darryl? There you go.
Seasonal infertility, heat stress. You didn't touch on photo, light, all rubbish.
No, very good question. And I told you that there are people. What we find is you almost can't build a facility that you can actually control the light like we'd like to experimentally. There are some papers that show that they get an effect with light. I've got record groups in the United States that say they get a difference in light. But when I go to different facilities and buildings, what I actually find out, I'm not real convinced light's the biggest driver. The big drivers are if you fall short on feed, you fall short on heat stress, you will likely have a bigger effect with seasonal infertility. Light is a factor. It sets it up, but you can actually counteract a lot of it, would be my opinion right now. The research just is not solid enough. Thanks for the question. Yep. Yes?
Sorry.
Yeah, Mark. Tim Kingmar, producer in Victoria. My question, right at the end, you talked about pooling boar semen.
Yeah.
So now, what would you recommend to a farmer, to pool it or to keep it separate so you can analyse the boars?
Yeah, no, and it is not being negative to pooling semen. I'm not. What we're finding out, though, is if I sort it out and I take all my highest EBV boars and sort those guys for a fertility test, what we find is that we can go back to pooling after I've done the fertility tests. We get much, much better results on live-born. And I can tell you, I have one herd that moved their live-born issue on the farm to pigs. And they've had it in place for a year, and they're absolutely convinced. They said it's the best thing they ever did was actually starting the fertility test. They're now putting the semen back together. Rather than just using individual sire matings, it has a huge impact for them. And we've now seen it in 2 other farms. They're also finding the same success. Not quite as high a litter size change. And so what you're doing if you have a poor quality boar, you are limiting the potential of the sow. And so you really let the sows go to their full potential.
2 more questions. Suzanne first, and then I'll get
Yep.
Thank you. Susanna Hermish from Expo. You said boars, the sows shouldn't be too fat, but the modern sows, of course, are quite lean. So where is your threshold in regard to too fat?
Very good question. If it's gilts, where I don't like anything that gets over 24 millimeters, I actually prefer my gilts somewhere between the range of about 22 down to 12. I don't like being below 12. We actually do find a decline in performance below 12. In between there, we can't tell a difference in performance of those gilts at all. So that's my number I tend to use on gilts. In sows, when we walk that, I don't have as definitive pattern of what we use. I do that more on the gilts. But if I get a gilt fat, they tend to leave the herd early. Had another question. Sorry.
Mark, David Plant. You scared the hell out of me. Australia has a lot of sows outdoors.
Yes.
And feed intake, lactation feed intake during summer is a significant problem. Should we be looking at changing the density of our lactation diets during summer?
Yeah, some. Here's the issue. You can only go so far with fat. Fat does a really nice job of feeding the little piglets. If we move fat, it does that. What happens to us is that the reproductive notion is really about carbohydrates and amino acids. That's what affects reproduction. Fat has very little influence on that unless you have 0 cholesterol. If they're completely lipid deprived, that's a different story. So nutrient density is a good thing if we can get a little more groceries into them and if it spares body weight. Things that you can do if they're outside. One thing that was interesting in Ollie Peltonimi's, I think it was his PhD thesis. I can't remember if it was a thesis or a paper. But he actually showed when he got more roughage into a sow, so if he actually feeding them hay, he actually improved their reproductive performance. And so that went up with outdoors, and that just to give them more fiber and fill, and that they actually tended to consume more feed by changing that dynamic. And so, again, I don't have enough experience. I've only worked with a couple of outdoor systems, and so I'm probably not an expert at that. But thank you for your question.